Okay, recording has started. All right, so in my experience, having a copyright policy has just really made my life so much easier. So I'm just kind of trying to come at it from that perspective. It basically takes a really pretty complex topic, combining both copyright and reuse, and sort of helps you figure out what you can and can't do. And then you can really tailor it to, either your employees that work within a library or a media center, or you can also tailor it to the patrons that you're serving. And that can be really useful too. uh, the policy that I work under at the University of Utah has really helped kind of speed up a lot of the decision making that we do. So like when these weird questions come up, like instead of having to always go and check the statute or go and talk to the attorneys, like I can just very quickly go and consult the policy, and that is so much quicker. And then while a lot of times like policies can kind of feel maybe onerous or a little bit overbearing, like I've actually in my experience found that it has provided a lot of clarity in really kind of confusing and uncertain situations. So this is just kind of the bigger picture of how I'm kind of coming at this policy question. So basically, if you are kind of thinking about, whether or not your library or media center needs a good policy or a policy, then a way to kind of make it effective is to kind of start thinking about what the purpose of the policy is and make it really clear, and then kind of come up with some good definitions. And we're going to go over a lot of definitions in this presentation, and then try and get as much input from those that are closest to the work, because that's where those bulk of those questions can come up, like on service desks and whoever's working with teachers, and like that, really getting a lot of information from them can really help you hone in and refine your policy. And then always try and think about who the point person is. And this is one thing that's maybe been good about this role of having a copyright librarian at the University of Utah, is that my name itself is not on the policy, but we referenced Marriott Library in the policy, and then people know to reach out to me because I have that in my title. So that's been really useful too, is just having a designated person who can kind of act as that point person to answer these questions and then kind of help oversee the policy. All right, so kind of getting into what, like if you did end up doing a policy, like what definitions you would use. And this is the part that will kind of also help you understand a little bit more how the copyright system works. So this is just kind of, these are the nuts and bolts aspects of the definition. And then I have another definition too that I've kind of come up with on my own on the next slide. But basically it's the system of rights and exceptions. There are 6 rights, and I will show them to you. And then there are 10 exceptions, and I'll show you just a few of those, a few that are just the most relevant. And basically the purpose of it is to incentivize the progress of arts and sciences. It gives a limited time monopoly to authors and creators so that they can be compensated for their intellectual efforts. Some people think it's way too long of a term. Some people think it's way too short. So there's a lot of, kind of argument there, but that's its basic purpose. And then these rights, the 6 rights, they vest automatically when an idea gets expressed from someone's mind and fixed in a tangible medium. And like there's all kinds of tangible media. So paper, a computer disk, like stone. I mean, it can be, you can have a canvas, like there's all kinds of media. So, but you don't have to do anything special other than have it be a product of your mind and have it be slightly original, slightly creative, and then make sure it's fixed in a tangible medium. It used to be that you had to register it, and there were all these kind of formal, like formalities that you had to go through, but then that has since changed and gone away, and it's now vested at this point of basically the point of creation. So these 6 rights can be transferred to in any combination, which makes this is where it can be like a really confusing system. So like all of the rights can get transferred to somebody else, a couple of the rights can. You can give permission to some people and not transfer anything. So it can get kind of tricky. And like sometimes those nuances can't really get hashed out in a policy, either by writing one or just consulting one. In those kinds of questions, I always have to go to our attorneys, but like that is really definitely where the system just gets messy, unfortunately. So this is how I have come to define it in my decade plus years of experience, is that I see it as a system of rights and exceptions that help define authorship, also defines ownership and reuse of content. And it's relevant to libraries in our mission to connect people to information and content. And we also, around that, provide services regarding the creation of content. So I think it's kind of relevant to us on this additional level, like that point of creation, basically, when something goes from somebody's mind and then fixed in this tangible medium, like 3D printing, for example. So those are, it's really like the library and librarians are just like right in the heart of this whole copyright system. Okay, so these are the 6 rights. I focus mostly on those top 5. That 6th one, I don't deal with too much, but it is becoming pretty more increasingly important with the web and the internet and streaming. So, but you can see, like, I just have come to memorize like those 5, and I just kind of rattle them off in my head. Like, the first one is probably pretty obvious: the right to copy, create copies of a work, the right to distribute them publicly, display them publicly, perform it publicly if that's relevant, and then to adapt the work, like the official term is create a derivative work. And then for sound recordings, there's also this right to transmit the work. And that is usually done by the radio, like on a radio station, but now, of course, also online. So maybe just think for a minute, you might have to unmute yourself so that you can fully participate and tell me your answer. But can you think maybe just for a minute, like which of these 5 or even 6 rights get engaged with in a library? Nobody? The biggie would be, the one that often comes up is like interlibrary loan. So there's like a ton of copying that goes on in interlibrary loan. If you are doing any kind of like digital library work, like, posting stuff in a digital collection, then you're definitely going to engage in a lot of these rights. Even if you're doing like a book display, either within your library or even online, you're going to engage in the right to display and the right to perform. Maybe not perform, but definitely display. If you're doing any kind of like movie event, then that's where the right to perform comes in. So these happen all the time in libraries. Like, we engage in these rights pretty often. And the good thing is that a lot of the exceptions, several of the exceptions, are relevant and related to libraries. So while we might be engaging a lot in these exclusive rights that exist with authors and publishers, there's a lot of like socially beneficial exceptions that we can rely on in order to meet that bigger library mission. So the main one, of course, is fair use, and that's section 107. And then the others that I'm going to touch on, of course, section 108, library and archives, and then first sale doctrine, which becomes pretty important in like our, physical building presence within libraries. And then section 110, which is an exception for public performance. That becomes really relevant for media centers, and definitely if you're doing any kind of online teaching or even face-to-face teaching, primarily face-to-face teaching. So one thing to keep in mind, like if your library or media center doesn't have a policy, these are the exceptions that you would really want to pull from. So because they're the ones that are going to give you those answers about what you can and can't do with these copyright protected works. So just putting that out there, like, and I'm going to show you how to get definitions of these exceptions and how, like, what I have found, like when you go to the attorneys to kind of work with them on a policy, like just knowing that these exceptions exist and kind of a little bit about their ins and outs can really help your policy become much more relevant to what the library does. Sometimes attorneys are not going to always know the ins and outs of all these exceptions. So you just kind of have to maybe educate yourself a little bit so that you can kind of say, well, we should say this, or we always get questions about this, like, can we use this exception to address this question? So I'm going to link out to the statute. That's really where you can get a lot of these definitions. But the resource I use a ton is called the Copyright Office Compendium of Practices. And I have that also listed as a resource too. So like between the statute and the compendium, like the work's kind of already done for you. You just have to go and grab that verbiage and then figure out how you're going to kind of organize it into your policy. Okay, so I wanted to just show you a couple of examples of libraries with policies, just so you can see how like different, professionals like us have sort of incorporated these exceptions. So this is just a quick example from a law library in Washington State. They combined portions of both the library and archives exemption and then that for sale doctrine, section 109. So you don't have to read the fine print of the policy, of course, but what I wanted to show you is where the sections are relevant. So you can see here that when they're talking about, what people can and can't copy in their library, like on a copy machine, they are pulling directly from section 108, and that's the library and archives exemption. And then this one here, where they're talking about, if the library can make a copy of a computer disk, they're pulling that from section 109. So, and you can see on this kind of second portion of the slide, so document delivery, interlibrary loan, such a common activity in libraries. So that comes straight from section 108. Okay, and then this one, I really like the Auburn Public Library. This is in Auburn, Maine. They use mostly just fair use, which makes sense to me. I thought it was interesting though, how they took that section and they applied it to both library employees and to patrons. So you can kind of see that section here. So they labeled it copyright, which, you can see that label here. And this is just on their website. So it kind of, is following the format of their website. But then you can see here, section 107, fair use. So it's talking about what library patrons can do, and then the copy and the library employees can do. And then you can see that they reference permission too, which is important to remember. Okay, so another quick example, this one I helped Snow College Library pretty recently, maybe about a year or so ago, and they were getting a ton of questions about how to host different movie events in the library. Some of them were course related, and then some of them were just kind of like general public events. So the library director there wanted a little bit more guidance and clarification on when he could say yes to which kind of event. So he kind of pulled from those exceptions that I mentioned, but then he took that verbiage and then worked with the state's attorney office for Utah. At the time, Snow College didn't have an in-house attorney that he could work with. So he just worked with the state's attorney office to kind of refine these exceptions that he used. So I thought it was pretty great what he had done. So he used a combination of fair use, library and archives, and then section 110.1. So you can kind of see that here. So he basically followed the outline that I was talking about earlier. Like he developed a purpose of what the policy intended to achieve. And then he pulled those definitions, like I was telling you, straight from the statute. In fact, I think we even went and pulled maybe from the compendium. No, I think we pulled his straight from the statute. And then you can see here how he just incorporated those 3 exceptions. And now, so he says he uses it pretty regularly to like help address this teaching and public movie event question. Okay, so just some quick examples. You can kind of see how this copyright system can kind of work within a day-to-day policy type setting. And now I just want to give you a little bit of uh, some brief definitions of how these, like what makes up these exceptions. So you can kind of start to see, oh, what can a librarian rely on and what can a teacher rely on? And if I'm in this, teaching support role, what does that mean? So you can just kind of see a little bit of the ins and outs. So fair use, you're probably already kind of familiar with. This is the definition straight from the Copyright Act. And it is within the statute. Like sometimes people will say fair use doesn't exist, it's only like this legal decision, which is just kind of not totally true. It's in the statute and it's a codified thing. And these are the elements that make up fair use. Like these court cases that deal with fair use, they'll go and rely on the statute. And then there's sometimes a definite judicial decision and analysis, but that the basis of that analysis is this codified statute. Okay, so it's not an infringement to copy a work if it's for these 6 purposes. If you're copying it for comment or criticism, for news reporting, for teaching, scholarship, research. Obviously, those last 3 bullets, super important for any library or media center, school library, media center. You're heavily involved in teaching, definitely in scholarship if you're an academic institution, and definitely research if you're at an academic institution. So keep that in mind. This is what fair use was codified for. And then along with these listings of non-infringing reasons to copy something, you have to kind of, this is the analysis part that a lot of judges will do, but a lot of people who are not judges, who are just reusing works, you can think through in your own head or in your own kind of evaluation how you're meeting these factors. So there's 4 factors and you can see them listed across here. There's the purpose of making the copy, and then there's the nature of the work that you're making a copy of, considering how much you're copying, the amount, and then what kind of effect you're going to have on the market for that work. So this is the balancing piece, and different judges and different court cases have balanced things differently. And this, because this is a balancing act, this is where you're going to want to get a lot of guidance from your relevant attorney, like the school district's attorney, like however whatever your context is, this is where you're going to want to get a lot of guidance and advice on how you should implement this little balancing act piece into your policy. Okay, and then here is the quickish definition of the library and archives exemption. This one can get really complicated too. So basically there are these 9 or so sections here. I've got them lettered out. I hope that makes it a little bit easier to kind of see the range of how this exception works. Basically, the gist of it is that it's not an infringement for a library to copy or distribute a work to of the exclusive rights. So that's pretty important there. If that library adheres to these 9 subsections, so you got to figure out if you qualify, you have to be nonprofit, your collection has to be open to the public, you have to kind of, figure out if you qualify. And then there are kind of these just slightly different rules for every kind of different subsection. Like there's different rules for how much you can copy of an unpublished work versus a published work. And then there's just slightly different rules for if you're creating, like if you're copying an article or just an excerpt of a work for a user. That's really where like document and delivery and interlibrary loan come in. And there often needs to be a lot of clarification about, how on amount, like how much you can do within delivery and interlibrary loan. And then there's a little bit of, some different rules for out of print works, and then what you can do with a copier and a scanner. Like you saw in some of those policies, like you could combine somehow, like doing section 108 and section 107 on your copy machine, so that you're kind of educating your patrons about like, oh, we're trying to offer the most flexible options for you to basically be creative and create these new works. Not only are we going to tell you what Section 108 says, we're also going to help you understand what fair use is, and we can work through, what that means when it comes to you copying a copyrighted work. So, and then there are much more restrictions around, like, music and pictures and sculptures. So, and that's what Section I really gets into. And then G and H are other just kind of fine print terms. So, but you can see just from that list that basically it kind of governs a ton of library work. So definitely one to be familiar with. Okay, and then Section 109, also covering a lot of library work. This is how we lend books, physical print books to people. So the gist of this exception basically says that the owner of a lawfully purchased copy has the authority to resell that copy, to lend it, to lease it, or to dispose of that copy. Okay, so that was Section 107, Section 108, Section 109. This one, face-to-face teaching, is Section 110.1. This is the public performance exception. And it is not an infringement for somebody engaged in face-to-face teaching to perform a work, so show a movie, for example, or to display a work, show slides like images of artwork. It's not an infringement if it's done by an instructor or students in the course of regular, systematic face-to-face teaching. It's got to be a nonprofit educational institution. It has to be a classroom. And then it can also be, let me back up. It doesn't have to be a classroom. It's got to be a classroom or a similar place of instruction. So this last bullet point, I've had a lot of conversations with librarians about whether a library is considered a similar place of instruction. And what I've talked to people about is go and work with your relevant attorney and see what they think. Work together, make an argument about why you think the library is a place of instruction, why you think this exception to performance and display is important for a library, and why it might be a nonprofit educational institution. It's going to be different for every media center, for every school district. So that's why it becomes really important to kind of have those conversations so you can work out these details. Okay, so as you noticed in that the Auburn, Maine example, they reference permissions, which I really applaud them for, because I feel like that's the one missing piece of the policy at the U of U, is we don't really mention permissions. So I think I revised it back in 2014. So I think if we were to do another revision, I would say I would be way more explicit about getting permission, because it's often this kind of mysterious piece of copyright, but it's actually pretty easy to do once you kind of know it exists and then kind of get into your own little rhythm of how to get permission. Then it doesn't seem so scary and onerous. So basically the shorthand is, when those exceptions, like those 4 exceptions, just don't apply to your use, like fair use doesn't apply, face-to-face teaching doesn't apply, Section 109 is not really relevant, then you go and get permission from the rights holder. And if in your policy you can somehow point people to permission resources, then all the better for everybody. So the ones I use a lot are listed here. I always use copyright.com. They're like a middle person broker where publishers and different rights holders will send to them their lists of works that they want people to pay them permission to reuse. Then users go search that site and then see what's available for what permissions are available for purchase. It can feel like a weird system because we're so used to just buying content. And you should definitely always check the license terms too when you are buying electronic content, because copyright.com isn't going to really be necessary for you if you have a license. But yeah, like when we're so used to buying like print books, it's like, well, okay, I bought the book. Isn't that sufficient? Well, it's not really exactly as as we saw in those exclusive rights. So you go to copyright.com to see what the rights holder sells in terms of permissions to those exclusive rights. You're not buying the rights, you're just paying for permission. So great resource, copyright.com. And then I also always check the US Copyright Office online catalog because they have registration records. It has so much information. So it'll give you, like if there is a registration record, not everything will have a registration record, but when it exists, like it'll have contact information and then like email addresses, you know, and phone numbers of how you can reach out to people to get permission. And there's a really great book that I use all the time. It's written by an attorney named Richard Stim, and it's called Getting Permission. Super great resource. Okay, so we could take maybe just a quick pause. We're doing okay on time. Does anybody want to unmute and ask a question? Definition of copyright, how those core rights work, or how exceptions work for libraries.
If no one else has a question, I would like to ask one, Allyson, if that's okay.
Yep.
As far as school libraries go, I think one thing that's been interesting to see over the past 7 or 8 months now is like exceptions to copyright related to COVID.
And like special permissions that people have been giving.
Special permissions, yeah. I wondered if you could just talk about that a bit.
Oh, definitely. That's such a great point. Yeah, like at the very beginning of the pandemic, there were like a ton of publishers that were offering free permission. And like the Copyright Clearance Center had even had like this whole page set up with like 200 some odd publishers that were offering free permission for educators and librarians to copy their works. And they had some kind of limitations, like you could only distribute, you know, you could copy a full work, maybe, like they were kind of trying to steer people away from copying full works, but they were allowing them to not pay any, like you didn't have to pay anything to copy the portions of these works and then distribute them to the students enrolled at your institution. So like we relied on that. They were calling it like the free educational permission or something like that. And it ended in August, which was unfortunate, like August 1st. But before that, we had relied on it for like 5 or 6 different works that we were copying because we couldn't do print shelf-based reserve anymore. So we got permission to copy a couple of full books, which was really exciting. So yeah, I think that's a great point. I noticed that Penguin Random House, they extended their storytime permissions, I think, into March. So like before, did you see that? Oh, good. Yeah. And like there were a couple of different, I think the state library, Liz Gabatash, I think she had compiled a list of different publishers that were giving free permission for story time, for like online story time, not even so much like in person, obviously, which nobody could do. But yeah, I think Penguin extended, and I bet there's probably been a couple of others too that extended permission for online performance of their works. So yeah, it's definitely worth like kind of checking on, you know, like just doing a basic web search. Like if you've got the book in front of you and you can see who the publisher is, just like do a quick search for that publisher and just kind of peruse their site a little bit and see what they're allowing for during the pandemic.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that a couple authors had taken like to Twitter or social media and granted permissions that actually they didn't really have the right to do. It was more up to the publisher. So
yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
I know. Yeah. That is like a tricky situation because like when you're an author, you're like, but this still feels like mine. And then I think you kind of forget that maybe you signed something and what those fine print terms are.
Thanks for speaking to that. I think also Chris has compiled a resource like that for the SEDC region.
So. Oh, cool. Oh, that's super helpful. I have like I have a site called Permission Free Resources. I haven't been keeping up on all the publishers that have been giving free stuff, but from time to time, if there's something that's really important or relevant, I'll post stuff on that guide too. And I'd be happy to share that with Chris if she wants to post it somewhere else. Other questions or comments? Okay, let's keep going. Still doing good on time. Okay, so I'm going to kind of move just a little bit into more of the nitty-gritty policy piece. Like if you are interested in writing and creating a policy, I'm here to help, by the way, if you do decide to kind of go that route. I've helped a lot of libraries with this, so please don't hesitate to reach out. My number one suggestion is just start looking to see if you have an existing policy. Like it probably turns out that there is one and nobody knows about it and nobody has looked at it. So, but it's probably there, and you have to just kind of look in weird places that you would not maybe think about. So I've seen them listed under as a computer policy, or like at the U of U, they're listed as like a research policy, which kind of makes no sense. And then sometimes they're under interlibrary loan, or they're under like collection development, or, you know, they can just exist in strange places. So you just kind of have to start hunting and see what's out there. And then I just would start talking to people and asking your colleagues, like just, you know, ask like, well, are you aware of any copyright policies? And, you know, just kind of start a conversation. But if there's one that exists, it'll save you a lot of time. It's pretty easy to start from scratch too. Like Snow College just started from scratch, and the library director there kind of appreciated. I think he kind of liked that he could make it his own and start with a, you know, blank slate. Okay, so if there is one, then you're just going to kind of build from there. Just read through the current one and see what needs updating. Like when I had started in this position back in 2003, like the policy, or not 2003, I started in this position in 2008. The policy at the U, the reuse policy, hadn't been updated since like 1984, I think. So I was like, this is so old. It really needs to get updated. And like we were using this older, kind of outdated version of fair use. It was kind of the educational, I call it the small fair use, like where you had to, there used to be this weird test. You had to meet the brevity test, the spontaneity test, the non-cumulative use test. And so like, I remember reading that, I was like, nobody's doing that. Like nobody is like figuring out if they are like meeting these tests. So I kind of said that to the attorneys. I was like, I don't think anybody's actually following this. Like it's, you know, been out of date for a while. Like, why don't we just make it like a general fair use policy, and maybe that will make everybody's life a little bit easier. So that's actually kind of was like, leads to my next point. Like it was because I kind of knew what the big fair use policy, like statute said, I was like, we're kind of unnecessarily limiting ourselves. Like I think we could add a little bit more flexibility in here. So then that was kind of what initiated the conversation with the U's attorney's office, was like, well, you know, is there a way for us to maybe kind of enter the digital age a little bit on how we can really rely on this pretty powerful exception. So that might be something for you to consider too, like just kind of ask around if you've got an attorney for your school district, and or like how maybe it's the county or something that you'd work with the county's attorney or the city's attorney. Like you just kind of ask around too at the same time that you're asking about the existence of a policy. Kind of ask like what attorney's office you would work with, and then you just will start a conversation. And it can be, they're super friendly people and they're really nice and they're willing to help. And I think if you're coming at it, you know, we want a little bit more guidance on what we can do in the media center or what we can do at our library. Can you help us refine this policy? They're totally going to be on board. And then you'll also want to just maybe work with your library or school district administrators if that feels like something you should do. So like just kind of making people aware that it's something that's needed for your library, and kind of get some feedback on who might want to work on it with you, and, you know, just kind of start conversations that way too. So the kind of the harder part can be like how to distill your library's mission into a policy. That can kind of take a lot of conversation, but even just using your basic mission statement, whatever it is, or even just keeping it limited to the teaching mission, that's fine too. But it's just going to help you know, like, when some of the confusing questions come up that the policy might not fully address, you can kind of have your mission in there to kind of give a little bit of guidance about, you know, should we copy this full work? Are we meeting our mission by doing this? And it just maybe can have add another layer to help you make decisions. And then you'll want to just maybe think through your type of library too. If you're thinking, I think putting on paper, we are a school library would be really important and a pretty powerful place to start from. And it's going to really guide the rest of the policy, because it's going to be really clear that you need fair use in there. And it's going to be really clear that you need face-to-face teaching and the Teach Act. And then also, of course, library and archives too. So the mission piece is sort of like, okay, well, if we are here to inspire the creation of new knowledge, like the Marriott Library has that in our mission statement, then that just was a signal to me that that we should definitely map to this bigger, the statute-based version of fair use. Like, I was like, oh, okay, if we're like trying to incentivize the creation of something new, then we got to take fair use to the fullest extent. And it's got to be not only a library policy, but definitely an institution policy too. So you might maybe just for a couple of seconds, if you're taking notes or jotting anything down, is maybe just think for a minute if there's any key phrases from your library's current mission that might seem relevant to this copyright situation. So phrases like inspiring the creation of new knowledge, or, educating students, like whatever kind of that key, your core mission is, then you can kind of take that phrase and then build your policy from that. Okay, and then maybe the next thing to consider once you're sort of comfortable with like the mission and then the type of library that you are, if um, if those are not clear enough, or if you want maybe just additional like directional guidance, then I just pulled the line from ALA's professional ethics code. And I think this is like code number 4 or something, 4 or 5. And it says, we respect intellectual property rights and advocate balance between the interests of information users and rights holders. So like if your library mission, it just is maybe not gonna be sufficient, you could even use a portion of this. That, the purpose of this policy is to help us balance between the interests of information users and rights holders or something. Okay, and then here's just a really general outline. This is the same outline that Snow College used. So you're going to start with your purpose and your mission, and then you're going to pull in those definitions from the different exceptions. And then the actual policy, general rules for employees or for users, that will kind of just be part of your conversation with whoever's helping you craft the policy. Like, you'll just have to decide, like, do we want to include rules for users, or are we only interested in creating rules for library employees? And that's a pretty simple conversation. And then I did add a permissions bullet so that you can make it part of the policy. And this, of course, is totally in retrospect of what I had failed to do in my own revision. And then we'll be listing whoever the policy owner is. Doesn't have to be a name like I was saying before. It could be a title or some kind of point administrator position. And then you'll just fill in the rest of the details. So you can pull those definitions from the Copyright Act. And you can even use these slides if you want to, and because they came straight from the Copyright Act, or you can use the Compendium, and it's online, and you can just pull straight from their glossary. And then of course get feedback from your attorneys and your library director or the school principal, like whoever you feel like, whatever administrator line seems important. And definitely your colleagues, like those colleagues that are like closest to the work, they're going to be the ones with the most questions, and they're going to give you the most, like the best guidance on what to put in those general rules. And definitely don't give up. Policy writing can kind of feel like you're banging your head against the wall sometimes, but it will pass and you will get there, and then it'll be worth it. I would say, like, if you're starting from scratch, I think it took Snow College, it was about 6 months or so. When I did the revisions at the U, it was about that long too. And then if you're taking notes, you can maybe just jot down, just kind of so you can remember, if you're pretty clear on what your library's decision making process is, like if it's just the director, or if there's like a committee, or just kind of your basic governance within the library that you work. All right, then once you've got it written up and approved, then you can start implementing. And then these workflows I'm going to show you, you could even use them without a policy if you feel like it will make your life easier. So this is the fair use workflow that we use at Marriott Library. And this is also what I had shared with Snow College. So it's got 4 steps to it. This is just for fair use. I've got other workflows I'm going to show you for those other exceptions. So we examine the work and we figure out who the author or the publisher is. And then we usually assume it's the publisher that's the rights holder. But if we're not totally feeling confident about that, we will double check registration records. And then we look for availability of permissions. So we'll use the work in front of us. We'll search by title and author or publisher, and we'll start with copyright.com. And then for movies, we just have to go straight to the studio websites for the most part. And then for songs, man, that can take us a little bit longer. We have a permissions license for the campus. So we'll check those like big licensing agencies like CSAC and ASCAP and BMI. We'll go check their catalogs to see if the song's in their repertoire. And then if it is, we know that the campus blanket license will apply. And then for images, we will go and check artists' websites directly. Sometimes they'll be in Copyright Clearance Center, but that's a little more rare. And then we look to see how generally available the work is. Like we'll search the catalog, or we'll look at book vendor sites, and then just the general web to see. This helps us know, like, well, how is it only in print? Like, is it only offered in paper, or is there an ebook out there? Either an ebook for libraries to buy or ebooks for individuals to buy. Same thing with movies. Is there, a streaming movie for libraries to buy, or are there only streaming versions for individuals to buy? So that just kind of helps us address that 4th factor of fair use, the market effect. And then that's what leads us just right into our fair use evaluation. So we look at that, we take all the results from that market research, and then we use this really great tool from the American Library Association. It's called the Fair Use Evaluator. And we kind of have it built into a couple of our forms that we use. And that helps us know whether or not we're going to be within the U of U policy on reuse, whether or not we've met. We always feel pretty confident that we've met purpose because we're a nonprofit educational institution that does teaching, research, and scholarship. And then the rest of it, we kind of look at that balancing act. We see what the nature of the work is, as we're examining the work, and then we see how much we're going to copy, or however much the professor wants to copy. And then we incorporate that market research into the market effect question. So the workflow for library and archives, you can see is maybe a little bit more cumbersome. But so step 1 is just figuring out, like, if you're eligible. So you just would, figure out, make sure you're acting within the scope of your employment, and that you're not receiving direct or indirect commercial advantage, and that you're placing copyright notices at all the appropriate service points. And so we've done all that in Marriott Library. And then you look at, for like interlibrary loan, you look at when works expire. So we just really, we kind of do very similar to that fair use work. We just examine the work and kind of see, okay, well, when did it publish? Are we pretty sure it's the publisher who's the rights holder? Okay, well, what year was that? And then we'll look at like registration again. And so it looks kind of dense and text heavy, but it's really pretty quick. You get really used to it. And then if we're making isolated copies, then we check the borrowing records. I think that the borrowing records are for the other library. This is where like I always get really confused on interlibrary loans, but you have to verify that the borrowing library has also like some good copyright pieces in place and that they're conforming to the Copyright Act. So we kind of do some of that checking, and then we'll do fair use evaluations too for interlibrary loan and then also for reserve. And then for preservation, we do a lot of fair use evaluations for preservation, especially if we're distributing it. But if we're not distributing it beyond the library, then we'll just go with this library and archives workflow, and we'll copy a full work for preservation, but limit its access to the library's IP range. And then the public performance display workflow, it's a little more simple. So we just ask if the teaching is face-to-face and if it's part of systematic instruction. And if it is, then we just ensure the professor is using a legal copy, and which the library's copy would be the DVD, and then that professor takes the DVD and shows it in class. And then for online teaching, it really only, let me see if my next one has online. Oh, it doesn't have online, sorry. So, but for online teaching, then we'll use that combination of fair use and then section 110(2). So we sort of like ask the instructor to say, yeah, I'm the instructor. And then we say, well, if this is for online, then we gotta go back to this fair use evaluation, and we'll do that research that I mentioned. Then if it turns out that there's like a streaming version of the movie available for an individual to buy or rent, and there's not anything for the library to buy, we will go back to that professor and we will say, we're sorry, you're teaching online, which we realize we can copy, a brief portion, clips of this film, but because there's this individual version available for a student to buy, we can't copy the full work. And we're sorry, there's not a way for us to license the film. The rights holder doesn't offer it to libraries. So we start with like, we hope you're teaching face-to-face. Obviously in the age of the pandemic, that's not the best option. So we've been having to give a lot of no's to professors or asking them to choose another film, one that we already have licensed, that's already available online and already accessible. And then that's kind of worked, but there's been a few where we've just had to say no because the professor didn't want to do clips. It wouldn't meet the teaching need. So then we just had to push the students to go and buy or rent the streaming version. So for that, we kind of use a combination basically of section 110(1) and section 107. Okay, and then the last piece, I don't know if this will be helpful. We have a publishing program at Marriott Library, and I know that there's like a lot of school libraries that do the same, a lot of public libraries that also have a publishing program. So if you do, then as you're working with the attorneys on a policy, you might also kind of want to bring up the possibility of having them help you create a permission to publish form. So if you are putting out there online, distributing online, posting online original content, then you're going to want some pretty formal permissions to do that, because fair use just isn't going to really be relevant for you if you're publishing a whole work for the first time. So just keep that in mind. We have a permission to publish form in place at Marriott, and that's what we use for a lot of original work. Okay, we've done also, and if it might be useful for your school library, we have done a couple of trainings. I do just a lot of in-person trainings too, just like for an individual department or even like an individual service unit, not maybe not library wide, but like right where it's relevant at that service unit, then I'll do really direct training. So that might be something for you to focus on too if you've got, multiple people in your media center. And when the trainings that I do, we just go over those step-by-step workflow pieces, and then we kind of tweak it as we go if they don't quite match what they're currently doing. But I think introducing this idea of how to do copyright research has been pretty useful for a lot of library employees at the U. And of course, please feel free to reach out if you have questions about policy implementation or copyright in general. I'm very happy to help. So there's the reference to the book, which Chris very kindly put it into your ebook library too. I'm so appreciative that she bought a copy and so excited. And so it's in your library as well. And we have maybe just a minute or so if you have any questions. Okay, well, sounds good. I'm good with
Thanks,
silence too.
Allison.
Yes, you're so welcome. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference, and very nice to be with you.
It's great to have an expert in the state we can reach out to because this stuff can feel kind of heavy to navigate alone. So
Exactly. Yes,
appreciate
please.
your expertise.
Absolutely. And please reach out. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye bye.
See ya.